$6 billion. That's a sum larger than the GDP of Guinea, Sierra Leone or East Timor. It's also the cost that one international oil major suffered because of poor relationships with local communities and governments over just a 2-year period. It used to be said that companies should maintain good relationships with local communities to improve their reputation or to be good corporate citizens. Now, community relationships are beginning to be understood as critical to business success. Today, I'll share with you the results of collaborative research that the University of Queensland's Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining has published with the Corporate Social Responsibility Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School and business and human rights organisation Shift. In our study, we counted the costs that mining, oil and gas companies face when they come into conflict with local communities. The results are staggering, and they have already influenced the way that some companies are approaching their business. We interviewed 45 corporate finance, legal and sustainability professionals in the mining, oil and gas industries to understand the costs of conflict with local communities and the ways that companies are approaching this problem. We developed a typology of potential costs and analysed 50 cases of mine community conflict across the diverse range of commodities, geographies and types of company. The cases were used to understand the issues in dispute, how conflicts manifest, and the stage in the conflict cycle where the conflict was most prevalent. By costs, we mean the negative impacts on a company's tangible and intangible assets, including value erosion from failing to avoid, mitigate, or resolve conflict at an early stage. We use the term conflict to refer to a continuum from low-level tension to escalated situations involving a complete relationship breakdown or violence. What are the issues in dispute? Environmental issues are the most common issues precipitating conflict. But behind these, social and economic issues and unmet expectations about consultation and consent play an important role in shaping the broader mine community relationship. We investigated the issues that the parties to conflict had identified as those that were in dispute using 4 broad categories: social and cultural change, economic change, socio-environmental change, and an often overlooked category, the process of change. We included this last category because the way change comes about influences how change is experienced. We distinguished between the proximate issues that were presented as the triggers of conflict and the underlying issues that affected the state of the relationship but weren't necessarily the issues that triggered or escalated conflict. Pollution and competition over environmental resources commonly trigger conflict. Water and land loom large in the cases that we analysed. The distribution of project benefits, changes to local culture and customs, and the quality of ongoing processes for consultation and communication were important underlying issues that affected the nature of the relationship between the parties. At what stage are projects most prone to conflict? Well, mining projects are particularly vulnerable in the feasibility and construction stages. There is an overrepresentation of conflicts during these early stages that have led to suspension or abandonment of projects due to conflict. One explanation is that these periods can represent dramatic transitions for local communities, with major project impacts being experienced for the first time and large influxes of often temporary workers from other geographic locations. The feasibility and construction phases, however, also represent time periods when local community and civil society organisations, if mobilised, have the greatest opportunity to influence whether, and if so how, projects proceed. This is in part because the project is smaller and it's easier to contest, but also because at later stages of the project cycle, capital has been sunk into an area. Changes become costly to retrofit, revenues begin to be generated, and there are increased incentives for companies and governments to defend projects. Civil society organisations tend to mobilise and build campaigns around major government and corporate decision points, such as final investment decisions or impact assessment processes. The feasibility and construction stages are simultaneously a mobilisation point for project opponents and a period of vulnerability for project proponents. So what are the most frequent and greatest costs? The most frequent costs experienced by companies are due to delay. Delays of world-class mining investments worth between $3 and $5 billion, will cost a company roughly $20 million per week as a result of conflict. For exploration, around $10,000 will be lost per day of standby and early reconnaissance, and up to $50,000 for advanced exploration, such as geophysics and drilling programs. The greatest costs of conflict are the opportunity costs arising from the inability to pursue projects. There are two broad types of costs here. The first is the cost of lost capital already spent on a project. The second, and by far the most significant, is the lost future value of developing the resource. For example, in the highlands of northern Peru, plans by US-based Newmont Corporation and Peruvian company Buenaventura to open the Minas Conca copper and gold project spurred region-wide protests over water security. This ultimately led in 2011 to the suspension of the project during construction. The suspension put at risk $2 billion of capital that investors had already sunk into the project in the 2 years prior to suspension. Other suspended or abandoned projects include Vedanta's bauxite project in Orissa, India, Barrick's $8.5 billion Pascua-Lama project in central Chile, and the Skel Gold project in Argentina, and the Tambo Grande project in Peru. What are the most often overlooked costs? The most overlooked costs relate to staff time. Few companies factor in such costs, but the drain on senior management time when confronted with conflict can be substantial. Senior managers spend up to 50% of their time managing conflict at some mine sites. The issue of staff time is an opportunity cost, where instead of putting out fires, senior managers could be spending their time on productive activities and relationships that generate genuine value. Of course, there are also costs experienced by communities and situations where communities are not in a position to translate the risks that they may be experiencing into business risks for a company. Social actors commonly mobilise at immense personal risk to themselves. In the 50 cases of conflict that we analysed, a full 21 cases involved a fatality. The vast majority of these deaths were community members who typically died at the hands of state security forces called in to defend mining and mineral processing operations from riots and blockades. Is quantification a useful language? By using the language of costs, community relations and sustainable development professionals can communicate the value of their work to two key groups, senior management and the finance team. However, there is a need to link this business case to the company's values and ethics. There is a risk that by focusing solely on costs, it can encourage a cost-benefit approach to day-to-day management of community relationships. One strategy is to front-load investment into community relations capability. It only gets more expensive to buy support later, and this almost never leads to sustainable relationships. Sustainability and community relations professionals who have the skills to reduce business risks associated with conflict need to be empowered to have a greater say within their companies. This is especially true during the design phase of projects. Spaces must also be created for local communities and Indigenous peoples to have a role in decision-making. Without genuine involvement, mining, oil and gas projects will face increased business risks and potentially suffer huge losses. Contrary to popular belief, some of the seemingly most vulnerable and marginalised people in society, including Indigenous peoples, can have huge economic clout. The companies that fail to grasp this reality are pursuing a high-risk business strategy. The relationship between a mining company and a local community is just like any other relationship. I sometimes liken it to a marriage. Once a couple is divorced, very few remarry. And once a company is in conflict with a community, it can be very difficult to repair. With investment in capable professionals, genuine involvement of community members during project design, and early attention to issues before they escalate, companies can avoid the costs of conflict and design projects that are beneficial to all parties.